Here's an experiment for you. Take passionate experts in human resource technology. Invite cross-industry experts from inside and outside HR. Mix in what's happening in people analytics today. Give them the technology to connect. Hit record. Pour their discussions into a beaker. Mix thoroughly, and voila! You get the HR Data Labs podcast, where we explore the impact of data and analytics to your business. We may get passionate and even irreverent, but count on each episode challenging and enhancing your understanding of the way people data can be used to solve real-world problems. Now, here's your host, David Turetsky.
Hello and welcome to the HR Data Labs podcast. I'm your host, David Turetsky. And like always, I try and find the most interesting people in the world of HR technology and analytics to talk to. Today, we're talking to Mick Collins, who heads up SAP SuccessFactors People Analytics products. Hello, Mick. How are you?
I'm very well. Yourself?
I'm very good. Do me a favor, Mick. Give us a little bit of your background and where you've been and what you've done and how you got to being the head of People Analytics products at SAP SuccessFactors. That's pretty big.
Well, thank you. It's a gloriously undefined role. I run go-to-market for People Analytics, which is essentially our workforce analytics and workforce planning. But I spend most of my time with customers, either talking about the products or probably more importantly, the strategy of analytics. I don't have a background in this. I'm not a software developer. I'm not a data scientist. I actually was a researcher, and I studied politics in school, wrote a master's thesis on Richard Nixon, and then got into HR research, business consulting, and then made my way into the analytics space about 20 years ago. It's not a linear career path in any stretch, but I love the storytelling aspect. I think that goes back to my time as a researcher.
That's awesome. And we all know that HR analytics is all about storytelling, and I know we're going to talk about that a little bit as well.
We are, yes. It's often overlooked in a rush to go to technology or to look at the data. Really, where the rubber hits the road is how do you teach people how to interpret the data and then ultimately take action? And that's really one of the areas we're going to cover here today.
Awesome. One fun thing that people may not know about you is that you worked construction while you were in college.
I did. I think like a lot of people, I had all of these random jobs as I got ready for college. I hauled carpets from one truck to another truck, which is the most back-breaking job I've ever done.
Yeah.
But one time I worked construction for a friend of mine, and my job was to dig a hole, a trench, if you will, from the front of a house to the street. And he gave me no directions. He just said, there's the house, there's the street, dig the trench. So every day for 3 months, I was in the trench with my Walkman, just digging away. And when you can't dig, you have to pick out the clay with your hands unless you throw it over the side of the trench. So for 3 months, I did that kind of work. I got paid about £25 or $30 a week for that kind of work. And it's only made college much more interesting.
It sure does. And I imagine this really plays well into how you help clients now, because you got a really good understanding about what it's like to actually break your back. So it really probably helps you with helping clients finish fixing their holes in the ground, as it were.
Yeah, maybe the concept is you have a better plan. I had no plan. Right. I was just digging from point A to point B. So have a plan in place and execute against that.
That's awesome. So our topic for today, which kind of follows nicely from that, is closing the workforce analytics execution gap by using data to challenge conventional wisdom. That's awesome.
Well, thank you. It's a fascinating topic. Again, we talk a lot about technology and how quickly can we deploy a piece of technology that's going to help us move away from Excel and get us into true analytics. But this idea of the execution gap, I mean, this has really been shown to exist by surveys that have been done from year to year. In fact, I go back to when I joined Corporate Leadership Council back in 2001, then part of Gartner. We ran a survey and we asked leaders, how important is analytics to you and how effective are you at it? And about 75% of HR leaders said it's very important. And about 10% said we're effective or we're proficient at doing analytics. You fast forward now, and studies in the past few years have said exactly the same thing.
Exactly, yeah.
75 to 80% of leaders say, yes, analytics is crucial for HR. Anywhere from 8 to 15%, based on the survey you see, actually say they're pretty good at it. So there is this disconnect. It's the same disconnect that's been available, that's been around for about the last 20 years.
Absolutely. So true. So that leads me to the first question, which is about that gap and how you actually get people to move beyond the gap. And because people are pretty average at being able to use analytics, where do we go? What do we do to try and figure out how to overcome that?
Finding a great career has always been a challenge. But today, with the massive changes underway in just about every sector of the economy, in just about every country in the world, finding a great new career is even more challenging. And if you're a student, recent graduate, or someone else early in their career, it's even harder for you because you just don't have the experience that those who might be 10, 20, 30 years older than you have. The answer? The podcast. From dorms to desks. A podcast by College Recruiter job search site, where every week we take a deep dive into a topic specifically of interest to candidates who are early in their careers and looking for a great part-time, seasonal, internship, or other entry-level job.
Well, I think back to my earlier point, it's about having a clear and realistic plan. And a colleague of mine have an argument about this every single day. I say it only really takes 6 to 12 months to build an effective analytics program. He says, no way. It's 2 to 3 years. And I'm wrong every single time. He's right every single time. But we have to have that plan in place to begin with. And part of that is deciding what are the barriers to success. And we talk about this not from the pure negative perspective, but to be realistic, to say it might be about technology, or it could be about lack of money. But underlying that fundamentally, there's so many other barriers to success, whether it's the lack of urgency, the lack of skills within the HR organization, the lack of capacity to do this kind of work, and then ultimately getting leaders to trust the data, take action with it.
And I think that last point is probably a lot of people kind of overlook that part, which is that the data itself is, as we talked about on this podcast many times, flawed. And when leaders get small tastes of it, they get a little anxious about it because they don't actually believe in the data. And therefore, getting to a solidified answer on what is the data telling you and the storytelling you were talking about before has to overcome that leadership lack of trust in the fundamental underlying data of that.
For me, it's bizarre. HR data is held to such a high standard. We're talking about people here with biases and feelings and expectations. Yet HR data is held to the same standard as finance data, which first of all has many more regulations surrounding the capturing of finance data. Right. And it's not as though every firm doesn't restate earnings every 15 minutes. But yet HR is expected to have 100% definitive conclusions, correlations and causations that if we take this action, then something will result because of it. And again, this goes back to the storytelling. It's about the education of leaders that we don't have the perfect science. But if we don't make decisions based on data, we're going to be no better off in the future than we are today.
But I think you brought it up, which is a very important part of this, which is because finance data is regulated and because there are rules around what is a revenue dollar, for example, that the finance group is really held to a standard that is published, right? They understand the standard. Everybody understands it because there are rules. The FASB rules kind of lay out for you what is counted, what is not counted, and people go to jail for getting it wrong. Whereas in HR, you could have a very big disagreement on the word headcount between the CFO and the CHRO, because the CFO could say your data is wrong or your number is wrong, and the CHRO can say, no, our data is right and your data is right. It's just a difference in how we look at it. And that confusion, which is caused by the underlying lack of a significant rules basis in HR, forces that problem. And I guess one of the questions I wanted to ask you is, because you work with so many different kinds of companies in such different industries around the world, how have you talked to, or how do you help clients be able to come out with an underlying fundamental governance structure that allows them to talk more authoritatively about their data in HR, even though there's this amorphousness around the structure of the data.
Yeah. I think it's done twofold. From a bottom-up perspective, we've defined standards over the years for headcount. And I agree with you. Everyone has a different view on headcount, and that's perfectly reasonable. You have to match the definition to the outcome you're trying to achieve. But there will be multiple variations on headcount. We established a set of definitions that we use with customers to more accurately and logically count data in a way that we think makes sense. Again, not from a finance perspective, but just purely from an HR perspective. So when we talk about terminations, we talk about promotions, for which there may be 15 different reasons why somebody got promoted, and those are all captured in the system. We start from the bottom up with normalizing that. I think the second aspect now is what you're seeing with the SEC, for example.
Right.
SEC now mandating public companies report out on a set of human capital metrics. I think it's fairly vague on what specific metrics and how those will be calculated. But for me, it's absolutely a great step in the right direction. And we will get to a point where there will be more top-down standards on industry benchmarks, for example, in addition to where we were with some of those bottom-up calculations as well. So I'm glad we're moving in that direction. There will be short-term pain as we determine what those standards will be. But long-term, it makes perfect sense.
And to talk about Regulation SK, which is what you're bringing up, it does force public companies in the United States to mandatorily disclose data that is significant. It mandates the disclosure of material people analytics. And so what you're going to start to see is companies who say, this is what I think is material. And then the shareholders and investors and SEC will push back on them and say no. And I think what it might wind up doing is it might wind up with creating rules around what is material and what are these measurements, and then what are the expectations of HR data. So it's going to be forced top down on us, not from the bottom up. It's going to be forced top down because we're going to have to all agree that these are the standards that the SEC is looking for. And so we'll get there, just like finance has those FASB rules we were talking about before. We will get there because those material disclosures will have to happen in a way that we can compare them from company to company.
Yeah, in some respects, we will be pulled towards the shining light, if you want to call it SEC a shining light. I know well, that's for debate.
Some would argue,
time. Yes. We also have, I know the United Nations is putting together more sustainability reporting, of which human capital is part of that. So we'll get pulled in that direction, even if we're not necessarily as a domain or a function leading that charge.
And I think either way, it's going to lead to more transparency. It's going to lead to more understanding, and the HR team is going to be seen as the storytellers that help managers understand what we're saying externally and then derive an internal thought process and an internal strategy as well. So this leads us to our second topic or second question, which is, how do you tell a compelling story that matters? What kind of things do you provide to your clients and have your clients provide that provides them with an opportunity to tell stories about this data?
I think honestly it's based on the experience we've had over the years and some of my personal experiences. I've had some very good ones. I've also had some fairly terrible ones when it comes to telling that story. So I think the guidance is there. But I'd say we've all been in a situation where we've had the chance to go to present to a set of executives. And we have 30 minutes on the agenda to tell them about the story of human capital or a particular risk that we're facing. And we're about to go in the room and we're told then the meeting is running over. So now you have 20 minutes.
Right.
And then an executive has to leave early and you have 10 minutes. So you've got 10 minutes to distill all of this analysis and all of this data into a short, compelling presentation that then drives the next steps. So first of all, I think we have to be cognizant of the realities in which we work. You never get 30 minutes. You might be lucky to kind of get 15.
Right.
Yeah. I think from there, you use the word material. What's the material impact of this issue? Not termination rates, not movements, but how does this affect us as an organization? And that could be very high level. That could be very strategic in terms of how we're helping building the next generation of leadership, for example.
Right.
But it might be very tactical. How do we improve our health and safety programs to ensure that we're in compliance? But whatever that material impact is, has to be the lead item.
Absolutely.
And then I think
it has to be compelling. It has to be, I know you've probably done this in the past as well. You have to get the elevator pitch. You have to be able to boil it down so that if you were standing in an elevator with those executives, you could give it to them in a short period of time, knowing they're getting off on the next floor. And while that's not necessarily been a core competency of HR, because we've had the time and we write it down or we produce these massive PowerPoints, being able to be pithy about figuring out what's all going on in your human capital strategy in a short period of time is a really good skill to develop.
It is, absolutely. And I've seen the good and the bad of this. We gave a presentation to a C-suite. They're a retail organization. And we've done analysis with a partner that illustrated the top 5 competencies of the managers within their store and how those competencies correlated to business outcomes. So revenue per store, profit per store, shrinkage, engagement, and turnover. We had about an hour with the executive team. And I was part of the team that helped build the presentation. So I was also at fault here. We spent probably 45 minutes talking about the parameters of the study, all of the science that went into this, all of the investigation. We spent maybe 10 minutes saying, here are the 5 competencies you need to look for in your future store leaders. And we never suggested next steps. We ended with that common question, which is, what do you think? And the leaders said, well, it looks interesting, but we should do this for everybody, not just the store managers, but for every single employee in the company. So they, to a certain point, passed the buck. Yeah. But we didn't say to them, we're going to change our recruiting profile to look for these 5 competencies. We're going to develop more internal leaders with these competencies. And ultimately, this project went nowhere.
That is really disappointing because you did have the audience and you had the ability to change things. And it does happen, though. And I've been part of those executive conversations where you're trying to lead to a particular outcome. You never get there because the agendas in the room rule and the personalities and the proclivities of whatever those people are interested in kind of rule. And until you get to that elevator pitch, until you get to that really quick statement up front that may even be controversial, you probably never get there because you're dealing with some of the ins and outs. And as you were talking about, the parameters of the research, that's tough.
Yeah, and often the first question when you present the research is, who are these people? And so you give a list of names and someone will say, well, I knew Brian. Brian didn't leave because of this reason. Brian left because of that reason. And all of a sudden, you've been diverted off into this side plot of who knew Brian, and you've missed the fact that there are thousands of Brians leaving every single day.
Right. And that's why when we were talking before about the data and the manager's inability to believe in the data, it's because they have those instances where they had an issue with the Brian and they, that kind of takes over the conversation instead of them focusing on the science and the art form that you're trying to get to and not necessarily just the Bryans. So it's tough. It really is. The way to get around that, and this is something HR really doesn't have a lot of ability to do, is to say, hang on, we're going to get there. Let's go through the presentation. And I promise you, we'll address some of your issues later on. But let's get through it. Let's plow ahead. And I think we're going to answer a lot of your questions as we go through. HR has typically not been very good at pushing back on the C-suite when they're in C-suite rooms and when they're in those boardrooms trying to give those presentations. I've been accused of it. I've been part of it. And also I've been part of the people who say, let's get past this. Let's keep going and we'll get to your questions later. And sometimes it never happens.
Well, that's correct. My former CEO, Peter Howes, used to tell a story about workforce planning. And he said the only certainty of workforce planning is that the numbers will be wrong. It doesn't matter. In the next 5 years, it doesn't matter if you need 5,000 nurses or 5,010 nurses. You can argue about the 10, but you need 5,000 plus nurses. You have to start to take action today. So we will never get to 100% certainty. Almost in any walk of life, there is no way we get to 100% of certainty with data. But if we have enough data to at least advise on a course of action, it could be a pilot program. It could be a set of scenarios. It doesn't have to be we have to head down one path. But it is important to make those recommendations and say, yes, based on the data and the science and the backup of hopefully a team that we have, and if not a team, some guy from operations who's validated the results.
Right.
Then we're going to recommend a course of action on a small scale to see whether this plays out in reality.
Mick, to what extent have you seen HR being able to take risk? Because one of the things I think you're talking about is that we don't take enough risk, or we're not allowed to take enough risk to be able to use the numbers and the statistics and the measurements that we see and be able to go forward with those programs and fail at them and that be okay. How often or how successful do you feel your clients have been and the people you've worked with have been actually being able to fail or trying to fail?
I think it's just so difficult, again, because we're dealing with people and people have feelings that if I'm part of a cohort that, let's say the analysis shows that I should not be paid for 2 months instead of paid every 2 weeks, do I want to be part of that group and would I have a positive experience? I'm not sure. So I think it is very difficult. I know, of course, we're dealing with lots of legal issues around workers' rights, for example. So
Sure.
I think it's very hard to take those risks. I do think, yes, on a small scale, you see firms, particularly in retail settings, for example, where they change the way in which workers select their shifts. And it's much more of an onus on the worker to determine when they want to work. Again, with some parameters around that. You do see more of that. But that requires a cultural change and an acceptance that we won't always get things right. And I think it's just very hard to do with people. So there's a balance. We'll never have perfect data. We'll never have possibly an outcome that doesn't have some negative consequences. But if we don't move forward, you don't find things like remote working become much more acceptable because we didn't try in the first place.
And I think we're going to see a lot of experiments around remote working now and happen in the future, even with a potential vaccine that might be happening in the next 6 to 8 months. We may see that those experiments start happening, and we might see companies hopefully take some experiments to the limits and potentially look to fail and learn from it and keep moving forward. Because as we know, that's one way that companies can experiment and see how things work. And I think a lot of companies have been forced because of lockdowns into, the remote work. And hopefully in the future, it will transition from being an experiment to potentially being a permanent part of the choice that employees make about whether or not they want to work in an office with a lot of people with very limited return on that investment versus working at home, potentially having a little bit more work-life imbalance, but yet still being able to get the return on the investment for the dollars they're paid.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think for a lot of people, they'll find that remote working has been very beneficial to them. I find myself more productive working from home. I can easily switch from meeting to meeting without having necessarily to physically travel somewhere else. I think it's going to offer some opportunities for more flexible workforce planning, which traditionally has been very much supply and demand forecasting about, the number of bodies. Here we're talking now about the skills, the competencies, the passions. So many people in this terrible pandemic have developed new passions, some of which probably don't necessarily relate to the work environment, but in some cases, I bet they do. How do we harness those passions and have people feel engaged, not just about the job that they do, but also about sharing that passion with somebody else? And I think we'll look at more team structures. We might look at more borrowing groups of employees from one company to the next. So yes, I think it's going to change the employment value proposition for the workers themselves, and I do think it'll force us as employers to be more flexible.
And that's one of those things that's extremely hard to measure. That flexibility is hard to measure, but also that balance is hard to measure, and that what you were talking about, the ability for people to gauge that engagement is hard to measure. And people have tried many times, and there are lots of great studies around engagement measurement as well.
Like what you hear so far? Make sure you never miss a show by clicking the subscribe button now. This podcast is made possible by Turetsky Consulting and listeners like you. Thank you for your support. Now back to the show.
And that transitions well to our next question, which is using data to try and investigate the low visibility issues in HR. And, there are things like termination rate, which is by far the most common metric in HR. But what are some of the other more unique things you've seen or compelling topics that you've been analyzing of late?
Yeah, so you hit the nail on the head there. The termination rate is by far and away the number one metric that our customers tend to look at. It's very visible. It's very expensive. It's zero sum. Absolutely. Either you stay or you leave. And it's not incorrect. I think there are certain ways of segmenting termination rates. by performance, for example, that make it very valuable. But I do love the idea. This gets back to my interest in storytelling of finding those issues. You call them low visibility issues, those that are just below the surface, that are not quite making their way up to a scorecard, but people are starting to become concerned about. And so we ran a survey a couple of years ago at SAP SuccessFactors, and we asked organizations about what are those topics that are just below the surface that would have a material impact if they were to play out, but you just don't have enough data on them. Sure. And the number one response was employees who are asleep on the job.
Yeah.
So employees who, for better or for worse, many cases through no fault of their own, have stagnated. Right. They have sat in the same position year after year after year. Rationally, it makes sense to stay for pay or for benefits.
Sure.
Emotionally, they're checked out.
Absolutely.
It's hard to identify that without looking at the data. But if you feel, as you look around your organization, get a sense that people are not necessarily being as productive as possible, that might raise that issue up from a low visibility to one that's worthwhile of investigation. So that's one common example. We also look at things like hidden costs. So where do we spend money on our workforce where HR might not have the visibility into that data, whether it's contingent labor data, absence that happens, the span of control, the relationship between managers and employees? Where are those costs starting to mount up whereby analytics would be eye-opening if we did that kind of work?
So I imagine that you have a lot of clients who may be asking you for kind of the next generation of metric. Are there any really good next generation metrics that you found that people have been asking for? Or are there ones you're wishing for people to ask you for?
Going back to our earlier conversation about the SEC, at least in my mind, a question that keeps coming up is how do you use metrics, so a group of metrics, to better understand whether, let's say, Coca-Cola's workforce is better than Pepsi's workforce? So at a macro level, a metric or more likely indices that would help tell that story, I think, would be very impressive. Now, I still think quality of hire is one of those metrics that's very nebulous in nature, but people are asking more from to better understand how do we truly measure the productivity of somebody 6 months, 12 months, 18 months into the role. A fascinating question from one of our customers on the workforce planning side was, we've identified a set of critical jobs. Now, critical jobs in a company tend to be, from our research, from about 15 to 25% of the workforce is in a critical job. Mm-hmm. They turned it around and said, well, how do we statistically show that these are the most critical jobs? Some you might say are obvious. An executive might be a critical job. A sales employee might be a critical job. But in other cases, I bet we'd be surprised if we were able to link the jobs themselves, the work that gets done, the outputs that people are expected to deliver, bring that all together and statistically or scientifically say, in this company, truly the top 5 most important jobs are X, Y, Z, and we've proved that. And now we're going to overinvest in the people coming into those roles, even if they weren't ones you thought were not that important in the past.
So I can definitely think that by industry, there would be a lot of differences in how you'd measure it. But I would imagine you could definitely show, especially by industry, what were those ones that actually drove not just productivity, but actual value. And whether that's value to the customer, value to the company. And so you could talk about retail, whether it's the sales floor, whether it's the buyers, whether it's the merchandisers, whether it's the store manager that you were talking about before. In manufacturing, you could be talking about the people on the line. You could be, again, talking about suppliers and people in the supply chain. You could be talking about the salespeople. And then, go to the software development and the technology industry. And you could be talking about, whether the salespeople are actually selling the right thing and promising the right thing, or are they promising futures? There's a lot of differences you'd see by job, and it would probably be fascinating to see not only the end result and how correlative that is, but it would also be very fascinating to see what actually the fields were that you used to do those correlations and to find who those people are in each one of those different industries.
Yeah, a very simple example of that was a story I heard from an airline company at a conference a number of years ago. And they asked the audience, what do you think is the most important job in an airline? And people said, pilot. They are responsible for the life and death of the people on the plane. For someone who flies about 100 times a year, typically, that's important. Sure. And they said, no, that's just not the case. Yes, you get them to a level of proficiency. But beyond that, it doesn't make a truly impactful it doesn't have an outcome that's so impactful that it really makes a difference. The people that can make or break the airline are the people who buy the fuel. If you time the purchase incorrectly or pay the wrong price, you can literally bankrupt the airline. And those are the kinds of people we want to overinvest in. So again, challenging conventional wisdom, changing people's minds, getting people to go like, I never thought about it that way. That's the value of analytics.
And in some ways, the measurement of what you're talking about is instinctual and is not necessarily borne out by actual measurements that we'll be able to collect data on in the field unless you have a high enough N, unless you have enough samples to be able to actually draw that conclusion and be able to prove it by saying the error isn't enough to overlook this or to say it's just it's just error. I find that stuff fascinating because one would imagine that by industry, the managers, the executives, and the employees themselves would know which ones are the ones that actually drove not just profitability, but survival. And you'd hope that those people are not only the best paid, but have the highest insurance premiums on their heads.
Well, you would think that would be the case, and this is changing, to be fair, but if you look at a typical Masters of Business Administration program, how much time goes towards HR and people management? 5%? 10% maybe at most? So yes, we come into the situation. These leaders are unbelievably smart, unbelievably talented, but they don't necessarily have the training to be able to look at the HR data and then make adjustments accordingly. So that's why that makes it so much more important for HR to come with that point of view and not assume that everybody knows this, not assume that everybody knows that the fuel analyst is the most important position within the organization. Some may believe that, some may know that already. But for many others, it's maybe a breath of fresh air, some data and insights and a story around why that's so important that compels them towards, taking action on that.
And I think you actually brought this up before about HR being better storytellers and being able to use their insights and their understanding about the data and about their industry and about their company to be able to tell those stories, because the leaders may have overlooked these things because they don't have that lens that you're talking about that the HR people have been looking through for so long. And that's why we are valuable, and that's why they need us, and they need us to tell that story.
Yeah. A great example of a construction customer of ours who they were putting out a scorecard. They led with termination rate, but were getting no traction at all amongst their leadership team. So they talked about why that was the case. And for the most part, leaders said, we care about the two things that we are incented upon, are revenue and health and safety. If you can show me HR data that ties to either revenue or health and safety, you get a place at the table. You get the opportunity to really talk about this. Termination rate, it may have a relationship, but you've not done enough to join the dots for me for why I should care about this. So they went back to the table and started to reconfigure their scorecards and their analyses to focus on the drivers of revenue and the drivers of health and safety. Again, it's not rocket science. And I think many organizations are doing this. And in some cases, the leaders don't necessarily know what they want to see. So it's incumbent upon us to go and say, you are incented on these topics, and here's the data we're going to bring to support you.
And I think that's exactly the point that HR typically lacks, which is the understanding of the fundamental drivers of the business that then push the managers to want to leverage those HR resources as consultants, which is speak my language, I'll listen to you. Talk to me about things that can drive me forward. If you don't speak my language, I have to find people that do. And that's why you'll find business leaders talking to finance all the time, because they talk in the language of success. Again, we talked about it before. There are those rules that speak to what does revenue mean. And so finance understands that implicitly, and they're trained for that. HR needs to be better at that. And, I'm speaking about myself as well. When I go into a company and I'm talking to them about what they do, I have to be a good student of that company and what are their business drivers to be able to help them achieve what goals they're looking for. And I think HR has strained that relationship enough because they don't talk in that language. And hopefully they'll get there. And hopefully we'll have that meeting of the minds.
But I think they will. I see tremendous improvements. HR leaders across the board who are either self-schooled in analytics or came from an operations role, for example, they're bringing that kind of focus to the table. But yes, it's that last step of the mile of understanding the company, the culture, the situation, the executive room that I was walking into to make that presentation that went nowhere. understanding how do we lead you to water and make you drink, not just give you the water in the first place. But I'm very bullish about HR. I think we talk a lot about capability. I do think a lot of it is the capacity and the time to be able to do this and the investment we need to make. And that's why we need that plan from the very start to be able to build this out further, because the opportunity is there. I do think the ability is there. It's just bringing it all together and actually showing after 12 months or 18 months, here's the decision we made, the pilot that we ran, here's the outcome that we saw, and how we intend to extend it to a broader audience. It will happen.
Perfect. Thank you. So, Mick, we had a conversation that started very boldly about talking about how we're going to close the workforce analytics execution gap. And I think we got there as we talked about things like starting with the concept of what it is, and then talking about what are the steps we need to take to get there to close that gap. We then talked about how do you make the story around the data compelling so that leaders can understand and then buy into the analytics. And then we talked about some examples about how you can actually look at the HR metrics beyond just things like the termination rate. And in so, I think what we've done is we've created an understanding that leaders in HR want to talk the same language and they want to close the gap, but it takes a little bit of understanding and a little bit of know-how on both sides and a little bit of skill improvement to be able to get there. Any final thoughts that you might have?
Yeah, I'll comment on your point there about the know-how. I think if you're not sure where you're going, any road will take you there. It's about having a clear destination in mind. And that destination is not, we want to be predictive with everything, or we want machine learning throughout the suite. Right. It is, we're trying, in this case, to help our leaders make more informed decisions through the greater use of data. And to do that, we have to step back and identify where are those strengths that we have within our company, where are the weaknesses, the opportunities, the threats, and probably realize that technology is important, but it's not the only thing. There's much more that needs to be done to build the culture of analytics than just simply technology. Or coming from a software organization, I probably shouldn't say that, but I do truly believe that the technology is only a piece of the puzzle. Having that plan and building aptitude and telling stories, I think, will be remarkably compelling.
I think until the robots take over the HR job, we'll still need to be telling those stories. So
absolutely.
I think you're okay.
And people love stories. Who doesn't love a good story or a good joke? I mean, that's the fun part of the jobs we're in here now, is hearing that and go, absolutely, that's really fascinating. So yes, we definitely need those kinds of skill sets.
Mick, thank you very much. You're awesome.
Thank you. It's been a great session.
I appreciate your support, and hopefully we'll do this again soon.
Yeah, looking forward to it.
Great. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Please hit the subscribe button if you found this fascinating. Also, please follow the HR Data Labs podcast. And if you have any questions for us, please go to the comment section and please ask away, and we'll return those questions as soon as we can. And thank you very much. Stay tuned for our next episode, and please stay safe.
That was HR Data Labs. Please visit turetskyconsulting.com/podcast to review the show, add comments about this episode, or add new ideas about upcoming shows you'd like to hear. Feel free to be creative, but please be nice. Thank you for joining us this week on the HR Data Labs podcast, and stay tuned for our next episode. Stay safe.